Well, good morning. My name is Pastor Steve Jobs, and it's great to. I'm just kidding. My name is Stephen Law. I'm the pastor here. You know you were thinking it. I just kind of helped you with that this morning. It is great to see everybody here, but especially if you're new with us, welcome to Grace Covenant Church. A year and a half ago, kind of in the middle of the pandemic, just as things were starting to open up, my family and I, we were desperate. We have 4 kids under the age of 7, and we were desperate to find some form of entertainment for our kids. And so it was like a rainy day, and we decided to make the trek to the Baltimore Aquarium. We took out a small mortgage payment to pay the fee for, 4 kids. And we're kind of walking. It was raining that day. We kind of parked far away. And, my kids during that time wore masks every day. But for some reason, on that particular day, with the soaking rain, with the long walk, one of my children refused to wear a mask. And so we wait in line, we get to the front of the line, I'm like pleading with the child, I'm begging, I'm bribing, I'm using all the parenting tricks. And as I get to the front of the line, in anger, this child, who shall remain nameless, took my mask and pulled it off. And it was one of those cheapo masks where it just snapped. Now, I'm convinced the most disrespectful thing you can ever do to a person is to yank their mask off of them. Pastor Mark, there was a feeling deep inside of me that began to rise up, and all I could think about in that moment was, Lord Jesus, I'm not going to jail in this moment. I'm not going. And I thought to myself, why did I ever have children? Now, there's quite a large percentage of people who hear stories like that, maybe their own family experience, and they would rather avoid the sleepless nights, the tantrums, the childcare expenses altogether, like permanently. A recent Pew Research Center report said that 44% of non-parents between the ages of 18 to 49 said it's not too or not at all likely that they will have children someday. So that's up 7 percentage points from just even 4 years ago. Why are people choosing to not have kids? Some cite the cost of having children. I don't know if you knew this, but it costs to raise a child to the age of 18, according to the USDA in 2022, $280,000 per child. I got 4 of them. Do the math. Some fear the future that their kids will grow up in, the world that we live in with wars and pandemics and polarization, racism. Some are worried about the environment. In fact, in 2017, a study was published by the Environmental Research Letters that claimed that the most impactful thing a human could do for our planet was to have one fewer child. Having one child instead of 2, for example, would save 58 tons of CO2 for each year of the parent's life. Finances, fear, environmental reasons, but the most common reason among millennial respondents in a 2018 New York Times study who said they didn't want kids, the number one reason was a desire for more leisure time. The late-night comedian Chelsea Handler made this rationale quite clear when she made an IG video. In the IG video, she says, the whole point of not having kids is to keep the party going. You can have fun. You can experiment with drugs. You can read books if you like. You can watch TV until 4 in the morning, or you can go to bed at 7 p.m. And maybe she's right. I mean, all those things sound pretty appealing, maybe without the drugs part. But I mean, I can tell you that since I had kids, I've lived far less adventurous of a life. No, there's been many blessings, there's been many joys, but I'm not going out with the guys at night. We're not taking spontaneous road trips. There hasn't been much of sleeping in quite a while. Jessica Wildfire, in an article entitled The Parent Trap on her blog on medium.com, wrote, "Parenthood is a trap. People want kids for the same reason they want pets. They see a baby and go, oh, he's so cute, I want one. They don't stop and think about all the hidden costs and responsibilities until it's too late. She goes on to highlight how hard parenting is, and then she calls parenting at the very end a scam. Now, we've been going through this series, if you're new today, called Meet the Family. And what we've been doing is laying out a theology of the family, basically doing a survey of the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation, looking at what does the Bible have to say about family. And the first week we looked in Genesis chapter 2 in the very beginning, Adam and Eve, God's initial plan for the family. One man, one woman in a covenant of marriage until death do they part. Then the second week we talked about where family dysfunction comes from. What's the root of it? What do we do about it? We looked at Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. And then last week, we talked about forming a family of faith in Deuteronomy chapter 6. We broadened that a little bit to talk about a spiritual family, small groups, a church like the one we're in right now. But we also looked at particularly a biological family. How do you form kids and a family in their faith? And we talked about how it's an immersive process. Deuteronomy 6 talks about teaching your kids about Jesus every moment that you get. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a mountaintop experience that happens over a retreat weekend, but it's in the morning, it's at night, it's over meals, it's at bedtime. And the question, if Jessica Wildfire is right, that parenting is so hard, and she wasn't even talking about adding to that, trying to teach your kids about Jesus, we were left with the question, why have children at all? Now, I realize many of you here today, probably about 80%, are not even asking this question, right? Maybe it's a ways away. Maybe you're past that season of life. Maybe there's some biological complications that are preventing you from having children. But it's important for every person here to have a holistic view of the family, a biblical vision for the family, because that's something that every single one of us needs. But there's a deeper question that this whole children question is tied to, and it's a question that every single one of us is wrestling with. Where do we derive meaning in our lives? We all want to live purposeful lives. Now, I'm going to make you do a little bit extra work than normal. Okay, I want you to pull out your Bible one more time. We're actually also going to look at those first two verses of Psalm 127. When I originally looked at this passage, I was going to skip the first two verses because I didn't think they had anything to do with the topic that we're going to look at today. By the way, the title of my message today is The Parent Trap? Parent Trap. Psalm 127 is a psalm of ascent. It was written by King Solomon during the golden years of Israel. Israel had peace from all their enemies. They had a wealth that they had never experienced in the nation's history. And the Israelites would sing these psalms of ascent as they made pilgrimage to Jerusalem. A couple times each year, the people would go to Jerusalem to celebrate these annual religious festivals, things like Passover or the Feast of Tabernacles. And what was unique about Israel compared to the surrounding nations of that time was that Israel had a theology of rest. What do I mean by that? All the nations around them were basically work machines, nonstop, endless work. But God had instilled in his people the importance of resting. He had them celebrate these festivals that I mentioned earlier. He had them observe a day of rest each week in the Shabbat or the Sabbath, which literally means to cease or to rest. So rest was a rhythm in their culture, in their families, in their nation. And they needed to be reminded when they put their work down on that one day a week or during those religious festivals, and as they made these pilgrimages to Jerusalem, they needed to be reminded of why they were doing this. And the psalm starts like this. It says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It's vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, Now listen to this one line of contrast. For he gives to his beloved sleep. Have you ever been there before? Where you're doing something, you're working, you're late up at night, you're early in the morning, and you realize, I don't think God is actually in the thing that I'm into. I think I'm building something, but I'm building according to my plan. Now, a couple years ago, I really have a heart for men in particular. I love all people, men, women, but particularly men. I have a passion to see men come alive in their purpose and in their faith. And so I got a team of guys together, and we started a ministry called Be a Man, and we did podcasts and blogs and YouTube videos and things like that. And I was convinced, and some of my motives I think were good, some of them maybe not so good, but I was convinced that these things were going to go viral, that hundreds of thousands of men were going to come to know Jesus through these videos and through these blogs. And after about a year and a half of these things, of the things that we were doing, I realized that the most important thing God was doing was not in the thousands, it was in the 5 or 6 of us as a team. We were making podcasts, we were writing blogs to reach the masses when really God was trying to form something in us. I was building something, but I realized God was building something else. And I needed to get in line with what he was building. Here in this psalm, the psalmist is challenging the people of God. This is directed towards those who are following God. He says, unless the Lord builds the house was the temple of God. It was a sacred work to work on this temple. Unless the Lord watches over the city was the capital of Israel, the pride of the people. It was a city devoted for God in Jerusalem. This was all religious work, so to speak. And yet the psalmist challenged the people that unless their work was inspired by their God, it was worthless. Paul put it this way in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. He says, if anyone builds on a foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, those are the things that will last. Then he adds wood, hay, straw. Each one's work will become manifest. The day will disclose it because it will be revealed by fire. Meaning that there are people building companies and businesses, building platforms. Seems like every millennial like me has a side hustle. We're building that email newsletter list. But the question is, when all is said and done, will what we're building, will it last? Will it stand? Is God building it or are we building it? Anxious, endless work is worthless because the psalm says it's godless. But the contrast is that God gives his beloved sleep. Those of us who know Jesus Christ, we can rest easy. Why? Because we know we're loved by God. He refers to us as his beloved. We're working not to please God, not to gain his acceptance, but we're working from a place of having already been accepted in Jesus Christ. It's what motivates us every day. It's what wakes us up, is that we get to partner with God. We get to build something according to his blueprint, according to his plan. Psalm 121, verse 4, behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Aren't you glad that when you rest, God is still working on your behalf? That was the remarkable act of faith for the Israelites, is while these surrounding nations were working 7 days a week, God promised they would accomplish more in 6 days than everybody else in 7 because God worked while they slept. Yes. The Sabbath, the day of rest, taking a moment to go on vacation, to come to church on a Sunday morning, those rhythms of rest reinforce your faith in God that he's working on your behalf. That your purpose is not tied to how much you can produce, but it's partnering with God to be a part of what he's building, to be a part of what he's watching over. Last week, we had a moment where some of us pastors got together from across the East Coast. Might have been a couple weeks ago. And I talked to a pastor who went on a sabbatical. And if you don't know what a sabbatical is, it's a moment after maybe 10 years of ministry or 20 years of ministry. People have different standards. But where you take maybe a month off or 3 months off or 2 weeks off. And I was asking this pastor, it's kind of like a talk, a conversation point for a lot of pastors, like, what did you do on your sabbatical? I haven't taken one yet. Maybe in a couple years when my kids get a little bit older. But I asked him, what did God teach you? And he said, the biggest thing I learned after 20 years of ministry, after pastoring in the Northeast in Boston, a very secular city, is that while I took 2 months off, God was still working. The church went on without me. And it wasn't an insecure thing. It was a freeing thing. It was a liberating thing. That this world has been spinning before you got here on planet Earth. And when you go, it'll still be going. That somebody's going to be at your job and take your place and probably do a better job than you. Right? There's certain things. Someone's going to be the pastor of Grace Covenant Church Capitol Hill one day. It's not going to be me at a certain point. And that's a freeing thing. Yes. Because God is keeping this world. Amen. He's sustaining it. He's watching over it. I was going to skip the first 2 verses, but the first 2 verses set up the last 3. Because the psalmist turns to what kind of building actually lasts. See, the beloved, those who love God, have a different strategy when it comes to purpose. They're playing the long game. They're willing to sacrifice now in order to find greater meaning later. For those of you who are parents, or maybe you're considering having kids, why would you endure the lack of sleep, the draining days, less flexibility, shuttling kids to doctor's appointments and sports practices? For those of you who are teachers, or maybe you're a coach, or you volunteer with kid builders, why would you undergo something that's so difficult, so costly? There's 2 reasons in this psalm. Here's the first one. The long-term reward outweighs the short-term cost. That's why you invest in anything, right? How many of you guys have ever heard of reaching FIRE? Have you heard that? Financially independent, retire early. I thought you were more savvy financial people. Okay, I guess this is the wrong room. Maybe Dave Ramsey, right? Any kind of financial investment, you are sacrificing now. You're not going on that exotic vacation because you're making some sacrifices now, knowing that there's an investment that's going to pay off down the road. Behold, verse 3, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward. Now, when Elise and I, early in our marriage, we had at that point 1 or 2 kids, and we only had 1 car. And we were working it. I mean, it was a test of our marriage, communication. Every night we're figuring out, okay, do you have the car? Do I have the car? How are we going to do this today? And the church was aware of our need. I mean, it's very hard to do life in the city, with maybe just 1 car if you're a family. And so someone donated a 2004 BMW to the church. And they gave it to me. There was only one problem. It was a stick shift, a manual. And I didn't know how to drive a manual car. But I was very incentivized with that BMW sitting in the lobby or in the parking lot of the church. And so, after I got the paperwork, that was a little bit of a headache. Took care of that. I had a coworker late after our Wednesday night service in Chantilly, Virginia. I had him, show me the ropes. And there was a building kind of right next door to the church that's still there that at that time was owned by some kind of government agency, okay, very secretive. And it was probably around midnight. I thought everybody had gone home, right? And so me and him are in this parking lot. I'm in the front seat of this BMW, never driven a stick before. And all of a sudden, a guy pulls up next to me. And he rolls down the window. And listen, I don't like to stereotype, but he looked like a guy who would be carrying a gun. And he just looks at me and he says, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Hey, I was just taking off, I was just leaving." And I turn on the car and put it into first gear, and it stalls out. And he's just looking at me. And I'm just, at this point, I'm red, right? "Sorry, sir, I'm just leaving." Turn it on, put it into gear, it stalls out. That was the longest 90 seconds of my life. I thought it was 20 minutes. It probably was just 90 seconds. But I literally thought I was going to die of embarrassment or die of whatever this man was carrying. Finally got it on the road. But can I tell you, when I was driving down Route 66 and I'd gotten the handle of it in that 2004 BMW, all of the starting and stopping, all the stalling out was a distant memory. This guy was a distant memory. Why? Because the hassle was worth it. You know, when it comes to children, there's a sacrifice. There's a learning curve. Sometimes there's stalling out. Sometimes you're downshifting and you're figuring out, what in the world am I doing with my kids? But there's a reward down the line. Kids are precious gifts now. They pull us into the present. They reveal God's heart for us. They reveal sin in our lives and our need for grace. But as they grow older, that legacy continues. This church, think about it for a moment. Many of you guys have never met Shanique Gray's parents, who helps with our worship team. But as she leads us into worship, you're experiencing the reward of her parents. Many of you have never met Nate and Becca's parents. You may have never met the Stiss parents. So many amazing leaders that are in this church, and yet you reap the reward of their parents' investment many, many years ago. John put it like this in 3 John 1:4. He says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. And this isn't just a biological sense. I've watched Elise, my wife, pour into 2 new believers a hidden work over Zoom, getting in the Purple Book, helping new believers grow in their faith. No pay, nobody's paying her to do that. But the reward, the sacrifice that's there, the reward is so much worth it, isn't it? Secondly, children aren't burdens to bear, but fashioned instruments of war. Look at verse 4. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Now, in this series, we've been contrasting 2 competing worldviews. We've looked at the culture's expressive individualism that says, whatever's in your heart, do that. Focus, orient your life around yourself. And we've been looking at, in contrast, the biblical view of family. And the world's solution to reducing problems have always been to conserve, to hoard, to restrict, to limit, to even eliminate. It's an agenda driven by fear and appeals to your comfort. Don't have kids. There won't be enough of this. There won't be enough of that. Don't have kids. They're burdensome. They're a killjoy. You can't afford them. This is nothing new. In fact, in a 1968 book, The Population Bomb, by Stanford professor Paul Ehrlich, he predicted that the battle to feed humanity was over. He claimed the whole earth was beyond what he called its carrying capacity. There would be hundreds of millions who would die of starvation in 10 years. India was supposedly beyond hope. He predicted the American lifespan would fall to 52 by the age of 1980. England would no longer exist by the year 2000. He was off by a little bit. What didn't he account for? What does this whole population restriction, what does it not account for? What the world doesn't account for is that humans are created in the image of God, and they possess his innovative and creative power. It's your mind, writes economist Julian Simon in his book, The Ultimate Resource, that matters economically, as much or more than your mouth or your hands. In the long run, the most important economic effect of population size and growth is the contribution of additional people to our stock of useful knowledge. And this contribution is large enough in the long run to overcome all the costs of population growth. There's a spiritual dynamic to this at work. See, the serpent, the same serpent who sought to destroy Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, was the same one at work in Pharaoh when he ordered the killing of all Egyptian boys in Moses' day. The same serpent inspired Herod to kill all the boys 2 and under in Jesus' day. And the same serpent tries to fool us into choosing to not have kids because it's less effort. He doesn't even have to kill them that way. God has a far different offensive tactic. God has always used children to overthrow the evils of the world. Whether it was a baby boy in Moses, hidden in a basket from the baby killer Pharaoh, who would one day deliver Israel. Whether it was Samuel, the miraculous answer to his barren mother Hannah's prayer, who became Israel's most accurate prophet. Or ultimately, God solving the world's greatest issue, the problem of sin, by sending his very own son, wrapped in swaddling cloths, laid in a manger, who would die and resurrect for the sins of the world. Arrows, the psalmist calls them arrows that find bullseyes in environmental issues, human trafficking horrors, food and water scarcity, global health issues, and ultimately in Jesus, God's arrow found the bullseye for the problem of sin. And not just, you're thinking, well, Pastor Steve, I don't know if my son's going to, our daughter's going to solve cancer, right? Find the cure for cancer. But even on a micro level, it's those arrows that can find the bullseye of a company needing leaders of integrity, a classroom needing an inspired, spirit-led teacher, a government agency needing, even if they don't realize it, an on-fire for Jesus Christian, a small group who desperately needs a leader who will love them and shepherd them. Investing in the next generation as a parent or a teacher or a coach or a mentor or serving with our kid builders as a leader may feel like stalling out in a manual car. Pouring yourself into a new disciple of Jesus may feel like you're going backwards at times. But listen to this quote. This is from a theologian, Derek Kidner, talking about this passage we're looking at. He says, it's not untypical of God's gifts that first they're liabilities or even responsibilities before they become obvious assets. The greater their promise, the more likely that these sons and daughters will be a handful before they're a quiverful. In a word, before the arrow is shot out, it must be drawn back. Long days, sleepless nights, extra expenses, explosive arguments, moodiness, hormones of the teenage years might feel like going backwards as parents, but they're evidence of an arrow being pulled back. And far from the fear tactics or appealing to comfort, God has always been about growth and advancement and multiplication and fruitfulness. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with kids. God told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. After the fall, he looked at Noah and he told him the same exact thing. Be fruitful and multiply. In the New Testament, he tells the disciples in a spiritual sense, he says, go and make disciples of all nations. He tells the church to advance. See, we're a small church now, and I hope we always keep the intimacy and the relationships. But I hope we don't always stay small, because healthy things grow, and God's family is no exception. Which brings us to the irony of Matthew 19, the second passage we looked at today. Here the disciples are trying to restrict the kids from coming to Jesus. They're replicating the thought process of their day, the world's ideology today, that children are a burden, they're a nuisance, they're second class, they're not worth the trouble. And yet they didn't heed the prophet Isaiah's warning, or not warning, but prediction, that the birth of Messiah, hundreds of years before, that prediction that he had, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. A couple weeks ago, I was at Mosaic, place in Northern Virginia, with some friends. I was waiting. We were going to watch some football game. And I was out in front, just sitting down, and two guys approached me from Mother God. You guys heard about Mother God? Mother God believes that it's a cult that believes a lot of strange things, but one of which is that they don't believe in the Trinity. And they pointed to this verse. These guys, the two of them, they tried to pin me down. Now, I felt sorry for them. They just picked a random dude. They didn't realize it was a pastor, right? But we were having a good conversation, going back and forth. And he pointed me to this verse. He says, this is a prediction about Jesus, right? I said, yes. He says, why is Jesus called the everlasting Father? I thought there was just God the Father. He was trying to say that the Father and Jesus are two separate beings, and the Holy Spirit, three separate beings. No Trinity. You tracking with me? Okay. People have debated this. How could Jesus be called the everlasting Father? How does this prophecy, particularly that title, refer to him? Now, we know Jesus isn't God the Father, but God's Father heart is expressed through Jesus. And when the disciples didn't realize that as Jesus taught them, for 3 years, he taught them. He provided for them. He protected them. He refereed their arguments. What was he doing? He was parenting them. The greatest father was ironically one who had no biological children. And when we choose to sacrifice our immediate happiness for the long-term reward of children, when we partner with God to fashion arrows that will be sent out to take down enemy strongholds, we experience a blessing that the hedonism of our day can't provide. We find purpose, not from frantically working and watching over something that God isn't in, but by investing in the next generation as parents, as teachers, as coaches, as volunteers. We find purpose in being fruitful and multiplying. In a biological sense, if the Lord allows, in a spiritual sense, by making disciples, healthy things grow. So here's what I want to challenge you to do today. I recognize there are people in different seasons of life. One, if you're single, and let's just say this is not even on your radar at all, or maybe you're beyond childbearing years, how can you invest in the next generation right here and right now? How can you support the fashioning of these arrows? Secondly, if you're married, maybe you talk to your spouse and you figure out, how big is our quiver? Now, the psalmist doesn't give a number. He doesn't say, well, you're really Christian if you have one child, or 3 children, or 5, or 10, right? He doesn't give a number. He just says, blessed are those whose quivers are full. So you all need to come together and pray and ask God, what's the size of our quiver? What is God calling us to do? Thirdly, I recognize maybe there's a person here or a couple who are facing infertility. And we want to invite you to come up and we want to pray and believe God for a miracle. We've had people in our church. Pastor Mark has prayed for people who we've seen miraculously have children when doctors told them they couldn't have children. And lastly, if you're in that demographic that you have children, I want to encourage you, we're starting a small group. First Friday of November, we're going to have a family small group. And what better way to encourage yourself and encourage those around you than to get in a community that are trying to figure this thing out together. Talk to the Warrens back there. Talk to the Johnsons who are leading that small group. I want to invite Pastor Mark up to the stage. Joseph, as a father in the faith, Pastor Mark is the founding pastor of Grace Covenant Church. Him and his wife 40 years ago and a team came to start Grace Covenant. I just asked him to pray a generational blessing. Would you stand to your feet this morning?